In the summer of 1578, a young king walked into the deserts of Morocco and vanished from history. His army, gone. His crown, shattered. His body, never found. They called it the Battle of the Three Kings because 3 rulers rode out that day, and not one of them rode back. But this is not only the story of a battle. It is the story of how a single afternoon on African soil destroyed an empire, drowned a kingdom in gold, and unleashed a ghost that would haunt a continent across the ocean for 300 years. What unfolded that day would bind the fates of Morocco, a crumbling empire, and a distant land across the sea in ways no living soul could have imagined. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss the shocking truth waiting in the final chapter. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and tap that like button to help this forgotten history reach the world. Because the king they buried was never truly dead, and what he left behind still whispers in the dust of Brazil. They called him the Desired One. Dom Sebastiao was born into a kingdom drowning in grief, the only hope of a dynasty that had buried almost every heir before him. From the moment he drew breath, an entire empire pinned its survival on a single fragile child. And that weight twisted something inside him. He grew up not among playmates, but among priests and soldiers. While other princes dreamed of love, Sebastiao dreamed of crusade. He read of holy wars until the candles burned out. He fasted. He trained in armor too heavy for his frame. He starved his body and fed his visions, mistaking obsession for destiny. He became convinced that God had chosen him personally, to carry the cross of Christ back into Africa and crush the Muslim powers of the south. Portugal in those years was still gilded with the memory of greatness. The ships had rounded Africa, touched India, claimed Brazil. But the gold was thinning, the spice routes were slipping, and the empire's brilliant century was quietly burning down to embers. Sebastiao did not see a kingdom that needed careful tending. He saw a stage for glory. To him, the throne was not a duty but a doorway, and beyond it lay the only future he could picture. His name burning bright in the chronicles of saints and conquerors. He did not want to rule an empire. He wanted to become a legend. His advisors begged him to marry, to secure an heir, to think of the future. He refused. A bride could wait. God could not. When word came from across the sea that a deposed Moroccan ruler was begging for an army to reclaim his throne, the young king's eyes lit with a fire no one could extinguish. Here, at last, was his crusade, his destiny, his war. He would raise the greatest army Portugal had ever sent to Africa. He would empty the treasury, summon the nobility, and gather mercenaries from across Europe. He would sail to Morocco and return a legend. But the men who truly knew war whispered a darker prophecy among themselves. They saw a young king who had never fought a real battle, marching toward a sultan who had won many. They saw arrogance dressed as faith. And as the fleet gathered in the harbor, sails snapping in the Atlantic wind, not one of them dared say aloud what they all feared, that the Desired One was leading the flower of Portugal straight into a grave. While Sebastiao dreamed of glory, far across the Strait of Gibraltar a very different kind of ruler sat upon the throne of Morocco. His name was al-Malik, and he had not been handed his crown. He had taken it. The Saadian dynasty was young, forged in conquest, drenched in ambition. Power passed not gently from father to son, but violently between brothers and uncles, each one watching the others for the flash of a hidden blade. Abd al-Malik had spent years in exile, wandering the courts of the Ottoman world, learning languages, studying armies, mastering the art of war from the greatest commanders of the age. When he finally returned to seize the throne, he was no naive prince. He was a scholar of power and a master of the battlefield. Few men in the world understood war as completely or as coldly as he did. But every throne built on blood leaves someone bleeding. The man he had overthrown was his own nephew, Muhammad al-Mutawakkil. Cast out, humiliated, stripped of everything, the young exile did the unthinkable. He turned to the Christians. He crossed the sea to Portugal and knelt before Sebastiao, offering a kingdom in exchange for an army. It was the spark that lit the fuse. For Abd al-Malik, the news was chilling. He knew the Portuguese were coming. He knew his own nephew was guiding them. And he knew that if a foreign Christian army took root on Moroccan soil, his fragile dynasty could crumble. So the Sultan prepared, not with panic, but with cold, brilliant precision. Nothing was left to chance. Every decision was weighed like a move on a vast and lethal board. He raised a vast army, tens of thousands strong, hardened by years of war. He gathered cannon, cavalry, and disciplined infantry. He studied every road, every river, every grain of sand his enemy would have to cross. And then, as the Portuguese fleet appeared on the horizon, fate played its cruelest trick. Abd al-Malik fell ill. A sickness crept through his body, slow and merciless, threatening to steal his life before the battle even began. The greatest commander in Morocco might not live to fight the most important battle of his reign. But the Sultan made a vow. He would not die in bed. He would ride to meet the invaders, even if he had to be carried to the field, even if it killed him. And waiting in his shadow stood his brother, Ahmad, patient, watchful, and ready to inherit a war about to reshape the world. In the early summer of 1578, the harbor of Lisbon witnessed a spectacle it would never forget. Sebastiao's grand armada filled the water, hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, nobles in gleaming armor, adventurers, priests, and mercenaries drawn from across Europe. It was a crusade made flesh. It was also, though no one would say it, a kingdom gambling everything on the dreams of one young man. When the fleet reached the Moroccan coast, the first warnings came almost at once. Experienced captains urged the king to strike quickly, to seize a fortified port and fight from strength. But Sebastiao, intoxicated by visions of glory, made a fateful choice. He would not creep along the coast. He would march inland, deep into hostile territory, far from his ships, far from the sea, far from any escape. The deposed nephew, al-Malik, rode beside him, whispering promises of easy victory, of Moroccans rising to greet them as liberators. None of it was true. The march was brutal. The African summer descended like a furnace. Heavy European armor turned to ovens beneath the relentless sun. Wells ran dry or poisoned. Supplies dwindled. Men collapsed in the heat, and the proud army that had sailed from Lisbon began to fray, day by scorching day. Still Sebastiao pressed on, deaf to caution, certain that God marched at his side. Beyond the dunes, Abd al-Malik watched it all unfold. His scouts tracked every Portuguese step. He saw the exhaustion, the thirst, the arrogance. He saw an enemy walking willingly into a trap of its own making. The dying sultan smiled grimly from his litter. The longer the Christians marched, the weaker they grew, and the closer they came to the killing ground he had chosen. By the beginning of August, the two armies were closing on a place near a river called the Macazin, by the town of Alcacer-Quibir. The Portuguese were outnumbered, dehydrated, and far from home. The Moroccans were rested, supplied, and waiting. On the night before the battle, Sebastiao gathered his commanders. Some pleaded with him even now to retreat, to negotiate, to save the army. The king refused. Tomorrow, he declared, would be the day God granted him his destiny. He was right that destiny was coming. He simply could not imagine its shape. For when the sun rose over the African plain, 3 kings would ride into battle. And by nightfall all 3 would be gone. Dawn, the 4th of August, 1578. The plain near Alcacer-Quibir shimmered with heat before the sun had even fully risen. 2 armies faced each other across the dust, and history held its breath. Sebastiao sat upon his horse in magnificent armor, surrounded by the noblest blood of Portugal. Before him stretched the vast host of Morocco, larger, fresher, and commanded by a man who understood war as the young king never would. But that man was dying. Hidden in his litter, Abd al-Malik clung to life by sheer will, issuing orders through trusted officers, determined to command his army even as death closed in. The battle began with thunder. Cannon roared. Cavalry surged. For one brief, glorious moment, the Portuguese charge struck home, and it seemed, just seemed, that Sebastiao's faith might be rewarded. Then the trap closed. The Moroccan wings swept around the exhausted Christian army like a tightening fist. Disciplined horsemen poured across the field. The outnumbered Portuguese, already weakened by thirst and the long march, were surrounded on the open plain, with no fortress to shelter them and no ships to flee to. And in the heart of the chaos, the first king fell. al-Malik, the brilliant sultan, died quietly in his litter at the height of the battle. His attendants made a desperate, fateful choice. They hid his death, propping up the illusion of a living commander so the army would not lose heart. The Moroccans fought on, never knowing their sultan was already gone. The second king died in terror. Al-Mutawakil, the exiled nephew who had begged for this war, tried to flee the collapsing battlefield. Attempting to cross the river, he was swallowed by its waters, the throne he had craved forever beyond his reach. And the third king, the desired one himself, Sebastiao, vanished into the storm of battle. Witnesses claimed they saw him charging again and again into the enemy, refusing to yield, swallowed at last by the swirling mass of horse and dust and chaos. When the sun set, the army of Portugal had ceased to exist. Thousands lay dead. Thousands more were captured and dragged into slavery. The flower of an empire's nobility was simply erased. But of King Sebastiao, there was no certain trace. A body was later produced. Few truly believed it was him. No one who loved him had watched him fall. And in that single terrible uncertainty, a legend was about to be born, one that would outlive everyone on that field. The battle was over in an afternoon. Its consequences would ripple for centuries. In Morocco, a new sun rose. The brother who had waited in the shadows, Ahmad, stepped over the wreckage of war and claimed the throne. History would remember him by a single dazzling title, al-Mansur, the victorious. And to that he added another, al-Dahabi, the golden. The victory had made Morocco impossibly rich. Noble Portuguese prisoners were ransomed for staggering sums, fortunes in gold flowing into Saadian coffers from the grieving families of Europe. Almost overnight, an empire that had teetered on the edge now overflowed with wealth and prestige. Ambassadors came bowing. Kings sent gifts. Al-Mansur had become one of the most powerful rulers in the world. But gold to a conqueror is never enough. He turned his gaze southward, across the vast ocean of sand, toward a fabled land richer than any in his dreams, the Songhai Empire. For centuries, Songhai had ruled the heart of West Africa, its cities glittering with scholarship and trade, its name woven into legend. Gao, Jen, and the jewel of them all, Timbuktu, where libraries held the wisdom of the world. Al-Mansur wanted its gold, and so he did what no one believed possible. He sent an army across the Sahara itself. Thousands of soldiers marched into the deadliest desert on earth, armed with something Songhai had never faced, gunpowder weapons. Many died in the crossing, but those who survived emerged like ghosts from the sand, and at a place called Tondabai, in 1591, they shattered the mighty Songhai army. An empire that had endured for generations collapsed in a matter of weeks. Timbuktu, the city of scholars, was plundered, its libraries scattered, its greatest minds dragged in chains across the desert. One of the richest civilizations Africa had ever produced was broken, its fall set in motion by gold won on a battlefield far to the north. And what of Portugal? Across the sea, the kingless empire could not hold. With Sebastiao gone and no clear heir, the crown of Portugal fell into the hands of Spain. For 60 years, Portugal would cease to rule itself, and its colonies would pay the price. As Spain and its enemies clashed across the globe, the Dutch turned hungry eyes toward the jewel of the Portuguese Empire across the Atlantic, toward Brazil. Invasion was coming. One battle in Morocco, 3 empires shaken, and the story had only begun to cross the ocean. In Portugal, the people refused to believe their king was dead. How could he be? No loved one had seen him fall. The body returned from Morocco convinced no one. And in the grief and shame of a broken nation, something strange and powerful took root. A belief that Sebastiao had not died at all, that he had survived, wandered, gone into hiding. that one foggy morning he would return across the sea to restore his people to glory. They called it Sebastianism, and it became far larger than a rumor. It became a faith. Impostors appeared, one after another, men claiming to be the lost king, gathering followers, shaking thrones, some of them executed for the dream they dared to embody. Still, the belief refused to die. The hidden king, the sleeping king, the king who would come again, became a myth woven into the very soul of the Portuguese world. And myths travel. They cross oceans in the hearts of the poor, the faithful, the desperate. Carried on Portuguese ships, the legend of the returning king reached the vast colony across the Atlantic, Brazil. There, in the harsh and forgotten backlands of the Sertão, the myth found new and burning life. Among people who suffered drought, poverty, and abandonment, the promise of a divine king who would come to save them was not history. It was hope. It was salvation. Centuries after the sands of Alcacer-Quibir drank the blood of an empire, the ghost of Sebastiao walked the Brazilian interior. Wandering preachers spoke of a coming kingdom, an enchanted king, a world made right. And one such movement, in a place called Canudos at the close of the 19th century, grew into a community of thousands, believers who defied the new republic, certain that a sacred king and a holy destiny stood with them. The young Republic of Brazil saw only rebellion. It sent army after army against them. And in a tragedy that echoed the catastrophe of 1578, thousands once again died for a kingdom that lived only in faith, the distant, undying echo of a battle fought on another continent 300 years before. A Portuguese king vanished in Morocco, and his ghost died again in the dust of Brazil. Two catastrophes, two continents, one unbroken thread of belief stretching across the centuries. Proof that the dead do not always stay buried, and that some kings once lost are never truly allowed to die. One afternoon, one battle on a scorching African plain, and the world was never the same. A king who chased a crusade lost an empire. A sultan who won everything reached across the desert and shattered the greatest kingdom of West Africa. A nation lost its independence, its colonies, and very nearly its soul. And a single uncertain death gave birth to a ghost that crossed an ocean and haunted millions for 3 centuries. History is not made only of dates and treaties. It is made of belief, of the stories we cannot let go of, the kings we refuse to bury, the hopes we carry across oceans and centuries. From the sands of Morocco to the backlands of Brazil, the same human longing burned, the dream that someone, someday, would return to make the broken world whole. If this forgotten story moved you, subscribe and join us, because so much lost history is still waiting to be told. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Sebastiao truly died that day? And when you're ready for another journey into the shadows of the past, the next documentary is waiting on your screen right now, because some stories never truly end.